So the topic here we have lined up for today is the Israeli lobby in the US, and of course all the most important things surrounding this that you need to wrap your head around if you are to understand US foreign policy, finance, and who is pulling the strings and who is in control. Good. Hi Jeff, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on with us today. It's great to have you on the program.
Great to be here, Henrik. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's going to be interesting. Of course, you've written Guilt by Association. Tell us how you came to write the book, Jeff.
Yes, I had worked in financial policy and politics for quite a long time, both in the U.S. and abroad. And while giving a speech in London, I met a fellow who told me some quite disturbing facts that I thought, frankly, were some kind of conspiracy theory. And to his credit, he challenged me to prove him wrong. And now I'm 12, now in my 13th year of working quite hard to prove him wrong and failing desperately, failing completely. And in the course of that, uncovering a form of systemic criminality that has sort of reshaped my worldview as to what is going on in the background that makes us endorse behavior that's not really in our interest, either as a nation or as a people or individually. And so Guilt by Association was meant to capture in the title, in part, how this criminality works, meaning we call it correspondence theory. If I'm associated with someone who is despicable or discreditable or whatnot, I look despicable. And that, in part, is what has happened with our long-term relationship with this Zionist enclave that we recognized in '48, that we now have been discredited by that relationship. People have tried to penetrate this phenomenon from the outside looking in. And due to the person I met and his personal experience, who will be identified in the next book, a sequel to Guilt by Association, he really profiled this from the inside. And that is very, very different. When you're trying to peer through a glass darkly, as the poets might say, it's very difficult to see how this actually operates. When you're simply inside and chronicling the facts of how it operates, then the how becomes very, very transparent. And what we're doing with these books is attempting to give people the tools of perception to see this corruption for themselves. There are an enormous number of conspiracy theories out there, and they are just that, theories. And that's why the book that you've seen has, I think, 110 pages of endnotes and only about 180 pages of text. It was meant to say, look, this is not some theory. Here's how it works. I don't care whether you believe it or not. Here's how it works.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. Let's just kind of get right into it here then and talk a little bit more about the criminal network that ended up controlling the U.S. government, that obviously took America to war, etc. How would you explain this to someone who either disbelieves this or completely, new on this particular topic, Jeff?
Well, some people call this Zionism. I was not comfortable with that term, and I still do not know quite what it means. I put it into the book at the very last moment. Trained as a lawyer, I just think of it as organized crime, very sophisticated and transgenerational.
Let's talk for a moment here about how a war with Iran would look like, because I think we've had the strategic toppling of various leaders and countries in the Middle East have kind of changed a bit since Iraq and Afghanistan, which was one method of doing it. I think what we've seen now in Libya and Egypt, and of course, which has now kind of spiraled out of control a bit in Syria and Iran too, is that the groups that we're talking about is basically largely through the West and NATO, etc., kind of funding various revolutionary groups. This is basically how Al-Qaeda arose with the war between Afghanistan and Russia. We now have ISIS and these organizations, whoever might be at the top of that, controlling them, that could be debated, but they're kind of running amok. But point being, they're being sponsored by the West in an effort to try to, detopple them. And it did work in a country like Libya. So what nature do you think a conflict with Iran would do? Would they do the same thing? We kind of saw, Twitter and the social media being part of this, of bringing out people onto the squares of the capitals in the city and demanding these leaders to step down, etc. Is that the nature of a war with Iran?
Well, let's hope we don't come to that. I mean, in truth, we've sort of been at war with Iran for at least since '79. with the so-called revolution there. But keep in mind, if you back up a little further, when George Herbert Walker Bush was the CIA director, he fired the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, as our source of intelligence in the region, including our intelligence in Iran, because he found, as with everything that we found coming out of Tel Aviv for the most part, they were lying to us. They were putting their interest ahead of ours, which is to be expected if you're an intelligence agency for a particular nation state. I would want my CIA to put my interest ahead of Israel. At the same time, that's the problem here, because this entangled alliance that we have, and we were urged not to do this, dating back to George Washington, said, do not do this, and we did it anyway. That we've had people manipulate our intelligence to take us to war. Now, what that would look like, I mean, we worked with the Israelis on the cyber warfare that helped, the Stuxnet virus that helped, run those centrifuges too fast, where they burned out in Iran's facility.
Yeah.
There. If that isn't waging war, I don't know what is.
Yeah, that's right.
So we've been at war with Iran. The question is, cui bono, who really benefits if we go to war with Iran? And it's not clear that it's us, meaning the United States and Americans. It is very clear that the war in Iraq, the greatest beneficiary of it was those who took us to war in Iraq. And you don't have to dig very deep to find who that was and who cooked the intelligence and who brought Ahmad Chalabi over here from the Iraqi fellow who provided all that false intelligence, or who featured him, Judith Miller, on the front page of the New York Times to sell us that narrative. So I'm confident enough in the facts that can now be mustered that I think this next war can be short-circuited. I hope facts don't make a liar of me, but the war with Iran is ongoing. And what we usually think of as a war is when we send cruise missiles in to hit hit a facility, or when we take some bunker buster bombs and drop them on one of their nuclear sites, which is too deep to be impacted by it. But that's a population of 80 million people. We will further outrage the entirety of the Muslim world, well, at least the Shia portion of the Muslim world, and this war will metastasize into something else. So here's hoping, if those doing this cannot persuade us to take on this next war, we will get enough stability, I hope, that we will uncover who has done all of this. You have to keep this ongoing turmoil and keep the eye off the ball in order not to have this investigated. And with Bibi Netanyahu coming to town to sell us on the war along with John Boehner, I mean, what could be better than that? So let's hope that's what it takes to wake us up.
Now, do you take the view that a lot of these so-called terrorist acts that have occurred, Paris included, actually might have some links to various intelligence services, that these are false flag attacks in order to justify the continuation of the conflict that we now see? Because obviously we see, and even if that's not the case or not, we definitely could see who's trying to use the situation in that capacity. But I wouldn't put it past them with the history of Gladio and other things like that, especially within in Europe.
Well, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, I mean, the best commentary I saw on it was two fellows. One of them said that if that editor was not such a narcissist, he'd still be alive. The other one said if he weren't such a blockhead, he wouldn't have attracted the violence that killed him and his colleagues. Now, I'll take it beyond that. Charlie Hebdo published the same cartoons that set off the cartoon crisis in 2006, when its Danish counterpart, again run by this Jewish fellow, and forgive me, that's just the fact of the matter.
You don't have to apologize for that. That's reality.
But, published cartoons with Muhammad with a bomb for turban, all that sort of thing. Now, it's all very cute, and I'm sure French culture likes this kind of stuff. But but the notion of free speech and whatnot came with also the notion you'd have some discretion. You don't yell fire in a movie theater, And so the extent to which they'd already been firebombed once, they had guards around them, they had a credible, threats beforehand. So once that happened, and I think this goes to the second part of your piece, once the these people were attacked by these Islamic terrorists, then yes, it definitely was used to advance an agenda. It wasn't a terrorist attack; it was an anti-Semite attack. It was let's dispatch 10,000 French troops to guard synagogues and Jewish schools. Let's hype this this notion that it's really an attack on civilization. I mean, I don't know if you recall, but in order to brand the Taliban in March of 2001, there was an attack on the Buddhas at Bamiyan. These are these ancient Buddhas on the Silk Road and outside of Kabul. And it was telling that no one really, I knew who the Taliban was, you probably did, but people who don't pay much attention to these things had no idea who they were. Suddenly you had an evildoer. You had a credible evildoer that done this awful thing. But it was telling to me that it was described in the American press as a cultural Holocaust. Okay, so you suddenly had this branding of these evildoers who, in fact, came online 6 months later, and there we are. So you've got, I think, again, an attempt to take an incident that was, foreseeable as anything, and turning it to this to advance this narrative. Now we'll find out in time whether indeed it was some kind of a false flag. Who knows? But it's interesting that one of the two fellows was at one time a roommate of the underwear bomber.
Yeah,
so-called underwear on Christmas Day, 2000, whatever it was. A Nigerian who managed to walk through security at Schiphol with no passport, having just bought a ticket for cash that had an incomprehensible flight plan to get him to where he wanted to go, very indirectly. And he was walked through. And then you look into that, and I'm sure you've talked with people on your show who've covered this, and you look at the people who handled security for Schiphol were an Israeli firm that was the same firm that had co-responsibility for the security at Logan Airport in Boston for 9/11. So I don't want to go there. I think that's all very interesting detail, and there are plenty of people digging into that who will, in time that will all come to, to be whatever it is, and whether that's, correlation or causation we'll find in time. I think what's more important is to keep your eye on the ball, which is how this works in plain sight by having you buy into a narrative and then take on an agenda that's really not in your long-term interest. And that's very much back in play right now. This sort of notion of what it is that we're fighting, and we're trying to make this very generic and show the repetitive behavior patterns and the sort of criminal behavior templates by which this works. You displace facts with manipulated beliefs. That's a classic one. The 5 primary pieces of intelligence on which we relied to go to war in Iraq, none of them were true. Yet we were led to believe that all of them were true. How does that happen?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so once you can get people to see how this works and they begin to see it themselves, I mean, there's no saying that best story wins. And the people being profiled are master myth makers and sophisticated storytellers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you concentrate on dominating that in between space, then you've dominated the story. There's an old saying, and again in system science, you can't solve a problem until you know what the problem is. And,
that's right.
So that's the immediate issue, is to make sure people realize there is a problem and here's its common source, and quit pretending it's otherwise, and don't be intimidated by those who want to shut you up with a smokescreen that they've used on others, because this is too serious. Just keep in mind the second part of the title is also hugely important. It's how deception and self-deceit took us to war. The first part is easy, but the self-deceit portion is far more sinister and often much more difficult for people to grasp.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the book provides the tools where people can begin to look in the mirror and say, "Oh my God, am I unconsciously part of this, but due to my own beliefs?" And the short answer is yes.